Greetings EPQers, just a quick video on how to develop your discussion, a little bit of structure, a little bit of technique for those of you who may be struggling with how to write a discussion. So let's crack on. Now, as always, there'll be some mark scheme nerds who are desperate to hear what the exam board has to say on it. And here we go. Here are four crucial components of the mark scheme. So this is what I will be looking at when I mark your discussion section. And I need to be able to show that the exam board that you've done precisely these things. So the first thing you need to do in your discussion section is show good understanding of the topic area. So do you actually understand the articles that people have written? Are you using the correct terminology? Do you understand the arguments that have been made? Do you understand the significance of the arguments that have been made? And it's quite a broad area, but an important one nonetheless. And it's, even though I don't have an expert knowledge of a lot of the areas that you're writing on, it's clear when you read that someone has a good understanding of a topic or an area. But also, more importantly, in a sense, and something which students so often fail to do, and I never quite understand why, you have to write an argument that answers the research question. And remember, you set that question yourself. So many people do not answer the question that they have put forward themselves, or rather they don't answer it effectively, and they don't have a crystal clear argument. So moving on to the next thing, you have to show a thorough and perceptive understanding of the topic area and a clearly argued and well thought out argument that answers the research question and is supported by several lines of reasoning. So once again, we're saying we need a very good quality argument. It needs to be an argument, but also there needs to be lots of, well, not lots, different directions to it. So by those directions, we normally mean sort of factors or themes or sub-arguments called different things and expressed in different ways. But fundamentally, that's what it is. Are there 3 or 4 different perspectives, different areas, different points of focus to your argument? So at the risk of being slightly patronizing, why are Led Zeppelin the best band in the world? Your different lines of reasoning could be the amount of money they made, the amount of songs of theirs that have been downloaded, the social impact that they had on bands who were to come after them, their contribution to world peace and harmony, or whatever. So 4 different lines of reasoning, and now they will interconnect, but you do need to have those separate lines of reasoning. Also, the exam will demand that you have counter arguments or alternative interpretations, and again, that's pretty simple. But you put forward your line of reasoning, and then you need to give a counter argument. So why is it that might not be true, or perhaps more likely, why is it that this might not be as important as something? And remember, when it comes to counter arguments, we will probably be acknowledging them, but actually pointing out why they're not correct. But anyway, we'll deal with that in a bit more depth later on. The 4th point in the mark scheme is the dissertation is well structured with appropriate sections that are linked together coherently. And this is something that people can forget to do, and it is certainly an important part of the mark scheme. So you can't write 4 little mini essays. They have to be linked together, sometimes explicitly, well, always really explicitly. Sometimes they're really easy to link together. Sometimes it is a slightly clumsy kind of linking sentence or 2 that allows me to tick the box. Anyway, that's what the mark scheme says. And I've distilled it down into a slightly simpler checklist, which really says the same thing, but maybe is a little easier to remember. So when you are doing your discussion, and remember your discussion is 26 out of 54 marks, so if you don't do a good discussion, you really are in trouble in terms of getting a good mark in the EPQ. So first of all, are you answering the question? you've set the question, so there's no excuse for not answering it. And are you answering it with an argument? Again, extremely important. The second thing, have you got multiple factors? Have you got those 3, 4, 5 different directions to your argument, the different themes, the different factors, social, politic, economic, military, technology, finance, ethics, there's quite a lot of common themes that come up in a lot of people's EPQs, but have you got these multiple factors, these multiple areas in which you can have the arguments? Do you have counter arguments? Now remember, you must acknowledge the counter arguments. You can argue that they are not as valid as your main argument. Absolutely, that's what you'll probably end up doing, but they need to be there. You need to show an understanding of arguments against. And finally, are the sections linked? So answer the question with multiple factors and counter arguments and link the sections. So these are the crucial 4 things that you have to have going on in your mind when you're writing your discussion section. So moving on to the actual writing of it itself. So imagine you have you've identified the 4 areas or so that you're going to do for your discussion, and you're about to start writing the first section. Now, within these sections, you could well have subsections, and that depends on the points you're making, your writing style, and content. So I would have thought most people will have some subsections in some of their sections at some point, but it will vary between EPQs. Some may have a nice sort of crystal clear 4 subsections per section. Some might have 2 in one or 3 in another, because there are 3 really kind of very connected but distinct areas that to get across. It varies. You've got to go with the flow, go with your writing style, and go with where the information takes you. But don't be afraid either way, as long as it's coherent and makes sense and it ticks all the boxes of the mark scheme. Anyway, back to the section. So you've chosen your section, and the first sentence is absolutely crucial, because that first sentence must be an argument, and it must answer the question. And in history and some of the other humanities, it's called a topic sentence, so you may have come across it before, but it's crucial that you start with this argumentative sentence. And it must, if you look at the information there, it must answer the question using key terms. And I think it can often be a relatively simple rewording of the question. So if you're saying, could we build a habitat on Mars, then it would be simple. Yes, we can build a habitat on Mars because technology or some other factor. We'll come on to that bit later on, but you've got to answer that question clearly, and you've got to use the key language of the question to show that you've answered it clearly. You've also got to make an argument. It can't just be part of telling a story. It can't be an expression of a simple fact. It must be an argument. And what it must also do is identify one of the factors that you are talking about. So if you're doing the causes of the English Civil War, social, political, economic, religious, it's identifying a specific factor: religion, technology, politics. So these topic sentences, these starting sentences could also, they don't have to, and you need to be a bit careful about whether you're being clumsy or writing something a little bit unwieldy, but often a very good one will link to another section, especially the section before. So you've just finished your previous section on technology, and now you're moving into your section on finance. Can you draw back to that section on technology in a relevant and meaningful way? This first sentence could also include a counter argument, and again, it slightly depends on the nature of the beast. If you're writing a section where rather than counter arguments you're approaching it from 3 different directions, it might be a bit clumsy and a bit strange to have kind of contradictory statement in that first sentence. If you're having an area that's really quite hotly debated, it would probably make sense to acknowledge it there. But you've got to go with the kind of literary and flow of what makes sense and what works. But often you will find a very good sort of section starting sentence will have all 5 of these. It will answer the question, it will use key terms, it will of course make an argument, it will clearly identify what factor it's discussing, it will link back to the previous section and include a counter argument or alternative perspective. So what I'd like to do now is have a go at writing these starting sentences. So you can imagine whether you're doing the first section, third section, fourth section, whatever section you like. But what I'd like you to do is have a practice. Reword these EPQ questions to produce an argument that identifies a factor and answers the question. Now you could try a link, you could try a counter argument. Obviously, you're going to have to imagine some factors, and don't worry too much if you are a scientist and don't know too much about World War II, or you're a historian and don't know anything about AI, which is artificial intelligence there, just to be clear. Don't panic. You could even say factor X or something like that if you particularly want to. Although I think it'd be good practice to try and tease out some relevant factors. So stop the PowerPoint and have a go at rewriting these so they are crystal clear answers to the question. Okay, so let's have a look at the first one. Could we create a city under the sea? So let's have a look. Now the second sentence there is what you'll often see in EPQs. Creating a city under the sea would cost £12 billion, according to Smith, the leading researcher in subaquatic architecture. A useful fact, an interesting statistic, but not a crystal clear answer to the question. In fact, arguably, it doesn't answer the question at all. Is £12 billion a lot in the grand scheme of underwater cities, or is it a tiny amount? Is Smith actually saying it doesn't cost us anything? Let's build it. It's really easy. Or is Smith saying, oh my God, £12 billion, it's too expensive to build? So this is a useful statistic, a useful fact, but it's not answering the question. And if you look at the sentence above, there is a crystal clear answer to the question. It ticks all the boxes. It could be argued that the vast cost, so there we go, we've got our factor. If we're looking at building underwater cities, I would imagine our 3 or 4 factors are going to be things like cost, technology, environmental damage, political will, that kind of thing. So we've identified a really important factor that we're going to have a lot of debate on, cost and finance. It could be argued that the cost of creating a city under the sea makes it impossible at present. However, the rapid change of technological development, now that's linking back to another sector, one might argue, will change this equation. So we're looking at a kind of counter argument or alternative perspective or a limitation in the not too distant future. So is this a good starting sentence? Well, yes, it is, because it makes an argument, it identifies a factor, it links back to a previous section, and it explores limitations and areas for further development. Now you could possibly improve that topic sentence with a fact, with a statistic, or with a figure, but there's always a danger of it becoming a little bit too unwieldy, and the statistics, the details are what's going to come later in the however many hundreds, if not thousands, of words you then write on this idea of cost and creating an underwater city. So next one, will AI take over the world? So let's have a look at the sentence. Although AI may well dominate financial markets in the future, it will not take over the world in a military context, as all technology is designed to require human input to confirm key decisions. So is this any good? Yeah, it's not bad. Again, we have to use our imagination a little bit, but it would seem as though it ticks almost all the boxes. So although AI may well dominate financial markets in the future, okay, that's probably referring back to a previous section on finance. It will not take over the world. Okay, so it's making a very crystal clear judgment, an answer to the question. In a military context, okay, so that's our factor, that's our theme. Our previous section was clearly about finance, and this section is clearly about military. As all technology is designed to require human input to confirm key decisions. So they're justifying, in a broad sense, why they think as they do, and then presumably they go on and use numerous examples of to support this, and maybe some that challenge. So yeah, that seems to be a pretty reasonable starting sentence to the section for this EPQ. Okay, so look at another one. Should we allow euthanasia? So again, let's think about this. Is it answering the question? Is it identifying a factor? Is it pointing out a limitation? Is it linking to a previous section? Euthanasia should be allowed in the cases of physical terminal illness. However, in cases of mental illness, the research is inconclusive, and thus it should not be allowed until further research is done. So it is clearly answering the question. Euthanasia should be allowed. It is pointing out a limitation, or sort of counter-argument, if you like, however, not in cases of mental illness. And it's identifying something that we can do in the future. Research. It doesn't seem to be linking to a previous section or a forthcoming section. It would slightly depend on, obviously, whether one section was about physical illness and one section was about mental illness. But let's just say it's not. Even if it's not, it's still doing a very good job of making clear what the argument is, and the link could come anywhere within the paragraph. It could be in the conclusion. There could be a specific example where it makes a lot of sense to link multiple ideas together. So it doesn't, a link doesn't have to come in that first sentence if it's going to make it clumsy or if it's not relevant. Good. So hopefully you can see what I mean about these sentences, these starting sentences, the section needing to have an argument, needing to identify a factor, and if possible, linking or counter-arguing. So what we need to do now is think about the examples within our section. And what do we have to do? So have a look at the list on the right. Well, we need to use multiple examples to support the points that we're making. So could we build underwater cities in terms of technology? Well, yes, we could, because we can create waterproof concrete. That might be one example or one area of argument. We can process oxygen from water. We can harvest fish. We can breed humans with gills. These are all different areas of technology that would go into answering the question. So those are the kind of multiple examples, if you like. Now, within these examples, if you can find areas of different focus or slight disagreement, that's good, because you can explore them and you can point out the difference and you can say what you think about the difference. On the other hand, if everyone makes an identical point, then you can explain that, you can point that out, and then that makes your argument even more convincing, because if you can say, well, actually all neuroscientists say that this particular part of the brain, when it has a slight abnormality, causes this particular problem in 100% of cases, that makes your argument really quite strong. Within the arguments of your section or your subsection, what you really want to do is try and find all sorts of slightly different examples that cover slightly different areas, but are all still within the kind of principal theme laid out. So, for example, if you're doing finance, you might look at, is something, was finance the reason for the war? The start of some kind of civil war? You might say, well, there was a high tax burden on the lower classes. The upper classes were struggling with an archaic banking system. The monarch had real difficulty with, printing money, and people from abroad were taking too much gold out of the currency system or something. So there we've got, it's all about money, it's all about finances, but it's actually little, different areas that all contribute to one big thematic idea. The other thing that you need to do is acknowledge the limitations of arguments, and this isn't something you should be afraid of doing. You can point out how everyone thinks this one thing, or lots of people have got a very similar idea as to what caused the war or what causes violence in young offenders. However, there's just this little area that we don't have enough detail on, or the argument is really strong in all of these areas, but it isn't quite so strong in this area. Acknowledging the limitations of your arguments, it gives you a lot to write about. Now, what you mustn't do is obviously say that those limitations mean your initial argument is useless. If that's the case, you shouldn't use that initial argument. What you also need to do is explore counter-arguments. So you need examples that provide a sort of an alternative opinion, or it could be an alternative interpretation of the same examples. It very much depends on the nature of the EPQ, and we'll see this all the time in say sociology, for example. What causes this particular imbalance in wealth? Is it race? Is it class? Is it gender? All these sorts of things. That you can have these quite sort of wide-ranging, passionate, and varied debates about a single statistic where no one is actually disputing the statistic; they're disputing the causes. So on the other hand, a counter argument could be, well, that statistic is wrong. So both are great counter arguments with different interpretations. You need to pick the valid strategy for whatever you're doing at the time. So let's try and break this down a little bit more with a slightly more general example. So we've gone back to our question, could we build a city under the sea? Now, our first section is technology. Do we have the technological ability to do so? And our second area, our second section is on finance. So can we afford to do it? So we've done tons and tons of research, and we've basically discovered that finance is a brilliant overall theme, but actually there are three different little areas, three different subsections that we can explore and then compare and contrast with each other. So our first subsection could be the cost of development. So could we afford to build a city under the sea? Our second area, which is still financial, but is actually quite a different thing, is can we afford to maintain a city under the sea? So once we've built it, maybe it costs £1 million every week to make sure that you can give it oxygen and water and preserve it from earthquakes and shark attack and all that kind of stuff. So again, financial, but again, different. Then our third sub-argument is about whether this city under the sea actually can generate income itself and whether that can contribute to its financial feasibility. So all of these things will be in the finance section, but they're all actually quite different little arguments. And what you might find, and a more sophisticated EPQ might start to point out that two of these three are impossible. So it's too expensive to develop and too expensive to maintain. However, if you could get it developed and maintained somehow, actually it would generate a huge amount of income and maybe something could be worked out. But actually, when you think about it, if it's too expensive to develop, too expensive to maintain, you'll never get to the point of income generation. So you've almost got a kind of counter argument, an alternative perspective built in there. Hope that made sense. Okay, so let's look at a sub-argument in a little bit more detail and see what examples we've got and how we might use them. So remember, we're looking at the cost of development of our underwater city. Now we might start off by, and again, all these theories are made up, so don't pinch them. So we might start off with a theorist, Zhukov, saying that $2 billion or £2 billion is the maximum viable cost of any development. So if it costs more than £2 billion, it's not financially worth building. So we've got a theorist who's come up with this kind of crucial figure that allows us to make a judgment on whether something is worth building or not. So we then move on to some examples. So our next theorist, our next example, is Smith, who says that an underwater city would cost £3 billion to build, and the majority of that cost would come from materials. So he would be a crucial example, or crucial piece of evidence, a crucial argument as to why we couldn't build a city underwater. Let's look at another example. So we've got Jones, who said it would cost £4 billion, and he says the most expensive outlay, the reason why we couldn't do it, would be because of wages, so wages of highly skilled workers. Our next example is Singh, who says it would also cost £4 billion, but actually he says the real cost would be in research and development. Then we have a fourth theorist, Barrington, who says it would cost only $1 billion or pounds. Now, with our original kind of idea that it would be too expensive, we've got some great kind of examples and a great way of exploring it. So Smith, Jones, and Singh all argue that it would be too expensive. So that's quite a powerful way of using it together. Smith, Jones, and Singh also give different reasons as to why it might be so expensive. So that in many ways makes the argument more powerful. Materials will be hugely expensive, wages will be hugely expensive, research and development will be hugely expensive. Now, a slight counter-argument to that, or maybe a significant counter-argument to that, is even though they all argue that it's going to be well over this £2 billion threshold, actually they're all saying it's for different reasons. So in a sense, they all agree with each other in that it's not going to be, in that it is too expensive to build this underwater city. But actually they all say it's too expensive for different reasons. So you could kind of play them off against each other and say, well, even though they all say it's too expensive to build, no one can actually agree on why it would be too expensive to build, and in a sense they contradict each other. So you'd have to do some quite careful unpicking there. And one of the sort of ways that you could unpick this would be, or at least explore this, is look at their expertise. So why does Smith think materials are going to be more expensive? Is it because he's a material scientist and therefore knows all about it? Or is it because he is actually an accountant and so doesn't know enough about materials to be able to make a judgment? And that's where the provenance, if you like, of the scholars, who they are, why they wrote what they did, that's where an exploration of that can be really important to the direction of your argument. So within these three individuals, we can sort of argue, we can counter-argue, but we can say they all agree that it would be too expensive. Now then we've got our sort of slightly more formal counter-argument, if you like, with Barrington, who says actually you can build an underwater city for $1 billion, £1 billion. Then we need to look at Barrington. Why is he different to the other two? Is he maybe only talking about a specific location? That could be quite important. Are Smith, Jones, and Singh talking about cities, in any given part of the sea, or are they focusing on one area? They're saying it's always too expensive, or only too expensive in certain areas. Is this guy Barrington, who's saying you can do it for $1 billion, is he only referring to a specific place off the Sussex coast, which has already kind of got a kind of pre-built, natural rock amphitheatre that you could fill in with concrete, whatever, who knows? But you see what I'm saying. So is this counter argument actually applicable to Smith, Jones, and Singh, or is it actually, or does it not really disagree with them? Is it too unique? Again, the other thing that you can explore would be things like expertise. Is Barrington a sort of Sunday Times columnist who, in his spare time, builds little models of underwater cities in his fish tank, which gives him an interest but not really an expertise? Is he an underwater structural engineer? In which case you might say, well, he really does know what he's what he's talking about. It's up to you. And the important thing, what you've really got to be doing, is explaining this process of analysis as part of the argument. What some people do is they look at things, arguments that seem to be partly flawed and just exclude them from their APQ. But you mustn't do that. You need to put them in and explain what's good about their argument and what's bad, and then weigh up whether you're going to give it any attention whatsoever. Now, as a sort of counter argument to that, you need to be a bit careful. You mustn't just pick sort of random crazies off the internet, include them in your argument, and say, oh well, we need to have. You told us to include arguments that weren't perfect. There's obviously got to be you need to include, or you should include, arguments that are valid and have some relevance, but that can be picked apart for part of them or all of them or none of them. So the next thing that you would need to do, or next thing you could do, obviously, is how could you link this to another section? So what would be an interesting thing to do, obviously, is when you're looking at Smith, who talks about how materials are the crucial reason why this thing would be too expensive, you could link that into a technology section. And if in that technology section you say, the sort of technological drive is that in 10 years' time, actually, it would be financially viable. You can link. You can then make Smith. You can sort of turn Smith's argument on his head and say, at the moment, he says it is financially unviable. However, in the future, when we consider this change in technology as described in section 1, according to Smith, at any rate, it would then be viable to build our underwater city. So that would be a good way of reinterpreting the argument and linking to another section, that kind of thing. It doesn't always work because there isn't always that crystal clear interplay between all sorts of sections, but I would hope at various points there would be. Otherwise, you've probably fallen into this trap of writing 4 different mini essays that don't hold together as a coherent project. So if you think about it, just looking back at what we've done, we have looked in our EPQ, we could have 4 sections. Each of those 4 sections could have 3 subsections. In the little subsection we looked at, we had 5 scholars, so you could have 5 scholars per subsection. So unless I've made a mistake with the maths, which is entirely possible, you could easily have 45 scholars, or rather references, I should say, in your discussion alone, because the reality is you will, whilst you may well have 5 sort of scholarly references, there'll be a lot from the same scholars. But hopefully you can see there how a bibliography can really build up and grow, and why the best EPQs will have 30, 40 references in their bibliography, especially when you consider there will be maybe not quite as many, but not far off in your research review, and then you'll always have some in your introduction and maybe in your evaluation and other conclusion and other places as well. So do just bear that in mind. That's how we get to these huge bibliographies. So anyway, just a few things to think about, things to make sure that you're doing all the time. What you must do is constantly explain why your evidence answers the specifics of the question. So why does this statistic, why does this fact, why does this theorist, why does this event, why does it answer the question specifically? Use, as we've talked about before, give some thought as to why using your evidence together makes your argument stronger. So have you got 3 people with different types of expertise all arguing the same thing? Are people arguing the same thing but from different time frames, or with regard to different time frames. So if someone's saying this is significant in the short term, someone else is saying this is significant in the medium term, someone else is saying this is significant in the long term. You know, all of those put together make a really powerful argument, because yes, they're all saying the same thing, but they're all giving a slight twist on it that makes a complete picture. Do scholars come from, or do they argue about a whole different variety of environments? You know, is something valid, you know, in the jungle, in the desert, and you know, in the sort of foothills of Brighton? You know, is something valid in space, in the air, and you know, underground? There's so many different ways of understanding that, but you know, and you've got to tweak that to the sort of relevant environmental issues of your EPQ. So give that some thought, especially when you're selecting scholars to use. Now, if you want a kind of proposed structure for an EPQ subsection, then have a look at this. It's kind of what we talked through already, and again, just be mindful of the fact that there's always a little bit of variety, a bit of variation. People do things very well in a slightly different way, and some sections will be different to others, and some subsections will be different to others. So I'm not saying this must be a hard and fast rule, because if I ever do something like that, you know, someone will write a brilliant paragraph with 2 examples and no counter argument in that particular subsection because they've done it somewhere else, and it'll still be excellent, but you know, they haven't necessarily followed the rules. But you know, I think this is a really good starting point for a checklist. So how will your subsection start? First of all, you'll start with a crystal clear argument sentence that answers the question, identifies a factor, and is an argument. You will then have your first example, be that a statistic, be that a theorist, putting forward a statistic or scientific idea, or you know, whatever it is that's relevant to your EPQ, and you need to then say how it answers the question. Example number 2, pretty much the same thing, how it answers the question. How does this example answer the question? Example number 3, how does it answer the question? Be clear, be explicit. Then think about using all 3 together. How do all 3 together make a really strong argument? You know, they all argue that finance is crucial, but this scholar looks at upper class, this scholar looks at middle class, and this scholar looks at lower class, or whatever it is, whatever's relevant to your EPQ. So think about how they all work together. Then think about the limitations, and acknowledging limitations is really not a problem. It's a good thing. It's good analysis. It's good research. So are there any problems? You know, for example, all of these 3 scholars write really powerful arguments on the importance of finance. However, they all wrote before the important finance bill of 2018, which may have significantly changed the situation. You know, so think about, you know, key events in history. So are all of your texts from before the internet? Are they from before a particular war? Are they from before Britain leaving the EU, or whatever it is that may be relevant? So, you know, think about some limitations, put them in there, but only if relevant. Now, if the limitations are too destructive, if you say, well, none of these examples are relevant anymore because they were written before the invention of the internet, well, then you shouldn't have based your argument on them. So the limitations are important, but they shouldn't completely destroy what you've just written, because then you shouldn't have written it. Along with limitations, perhaps instead of think about counter arguments. So counter arguments could be where someone, you know, goes against the opinion that the scholars have raised. So you know, scholar or example 1, 2, and 3 all talk about the importance of finance because there's this huge 25% disparity between wealth and classes. Then in your counter argument, you might say, we might have another scholar who says, actually, this 25% disparity in wealth is a statistical error. It's not real. It didn't happen. So you put that argument forward. But again, if you feel that is so powerful, that should be your main argument. So you would probably then dismiss that. You'd say, well, this is the counter argument that's been put forward. However, it's not reasonable to proceed on this basis because blah, blah, blah. Again, it's up to you. It depends on your PQ, depends on your opinion, and so on and so forth. So really that comes on to the last point. Why is the main argument, and I finished with this, why is the main argument still so powerful, still so strong? Even though there are some limitations to it, even though there are some counter arguments to it, why is it still valid and important to think about or think through? And that could be where you add in a link to another section or subsection. So there we go. It's always risky and dangerous to give people structures to sections or subsections, but hopefully that's given you something to at least explore, play with, think through, and I don't know, roll it up, set fire to it, keep warm, sell it for coffee, I don't know, whatever it is that you may do with it. Anyway, there you go. So hopefully I will see you in the not too distant future, but given the nature of the plague, who knows? Good luck.